Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm so very happy that all of you were able to make it here to the show lounge this morning, and I mean that quite literally. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing that the person who first coined the phrase 2 steps forward, 1 step back was on a ship at the time, because that's sort of like what it is trying to move around. But I'm glad you were able to come. I'm sorry you will not have an opportunity to go to Shimizu, as I know the captain and everyone else is, and see Mount Fuji, but we would almost certainly not have been able to see Fuji-san anyway today, so we're glad you could come here. My name is Ross Arnold, and my wife Carolyn, who's on the camera down here in front, and myself. This is our 14th opportunity to travel on a Windstar Cruise and for me to lecture, and so it's always great to be back aboard. We are on our 3rd cruise of this section, and we'll continue on all the way to Seward, Alaska. So if you were planning on getting off in Osaka, you might want to check. You could stay over and travel with us through Japan for a while longer, and then go over to Alaska. They may be completely booked, but I'm sure you could double up with somebody who's coming on board at that time. So give you an opportunity to see even more, and come back to Shimizu, for instance. My wife and I live in Mexico. I'm the pastor of a Presbyterian church in Mexico, but also the founder and director of a theological institute in Mexico. And because my background is actually in theology, specifically philosophical theology, I began early on teaching courses on world religions. And because of teaching courses on world religions, I became very interested in the history and the culture behind those religions in different regions of the world. And you'll hear a little bit more about that this afternoon. At 4:45, I'll be doing a second talk on the religions of Japan. I've already had people asking me questions about Shinto, which is a mystery to most Westerners. And, excuse me, we'll be talking about that. But as I began to get more involved in the history and culture, I was very much blessed by Windstar asking me to come aboard and provide some lectures in different parts of the world. So here we are again. Today, our first lecture is going to be Japan versus China. And you may be saying, well, we're not going to China. But any understanding of this part of the world really requires, I believe, an understanding of the relationships between the major powers in East Asia. And that would be China, Japan, Korea, while not a major power, has been a player because they're exactly in between China and Japan. And then to some extent, as you'll hear today, Russia. And so we're going to start out with a discussion of the history of the relationship, of the very rocky relationship between Japan and China. As I say this afternoon, I'll be doing a talk on the religions of Japan, and then we'll talk in the next few days, and just keep your eye on the daily program, because it'll tell you exactly when the lectures are going to be. On C days, I'll be doing 2. Most of the days we're in port, I'll be doing 1 at the end of the day, around 5 o'clock usually, but again, check the program. But we'll be talking about Japanese art and architecture, emperors and shoguns, a brief history of Japan. We'll take, some of these things are going to overlap and interweave because it's necessary to do so. I'll be giving you more detail in some of them and less detail in some of the overviews. Then samurai and the code of Bushido, the famous Japanese warrior samurai. A brief history of Korea and the Korean conflict. This is for our visit to Busan in South Korea. The Pacific War, the battle between the Japanese and primarily the American fleet, although the Australians and the British and others were very much involved in that as well. The birth of the atomic age, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before we visit Hiroshima, or Hiroshima as it's sometimes pronounced. And then Islands of Tranquility, Japanese gardens. I'll be talking about the specific nature, the symbolism in Japanese gardens, how they differ from Chinese gardens, for instance, and Western gardens. So we'll get into all of that as we proceed through the voyage. And based upon our experience, if you ever have any rough days, there's usually only 1 per cruise, so you're going to get yours out of the way and then be able to enjoy yourself the whole rest of the time. So that's a good thing. This family is really, I believe, the critical turning point of the whole history of Japan, and really the start of modern Japan. This is the Meiji Emperor and his family. This picture was taken in the 1880s. You will notice the fact that they are wearing, at least the adults are wearing, what would have been quite modern Western dress for the late 1800s. The Meiji Emperor, and Meiji means enlightened peace, was the first emperor to really take power since the late 12th century. In the late 12th century, a military ruler of Japan called a shogun, you've probably all heard that term, James Clavell's famous book, there was a mini-series called Shogun. The shogun was a military ruler, and in the late 12th century, these military rulers took control of Japan. The emperor was still around, but had no authority. He was just a figurehead. And so from the late 12th century until the mid-19th century, there was a military ruler, and the emperor was just on his throne, but didn't have any power to do anything. Well, in the start of the early 1600s, a new shogunate, a new shogun had taken over, the Tokugawa shogunate. We'll talk more detail about those things a little bit later in other lectures. But when the Tokugawa shogun took over in the early 1600s, he declared a period of isolation, which is called sokuru in Japanese, meaning the Japanese people were not allowed to leave Japan. The commoners, from time to time, a government representative would go out, and no one was allowed in Japan. So for over 200 years, from the early 1600s until the mid-1800s, Japan was isolated. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, with 4 gunboats, entered the harbor of what is now Tokyo. It's Edo Harbor at that point, and Tokyo doesn't actually have a harbor, but the harbor that serviced them. And he showed up with 4 gunboats and insisted that Japan open their borders to trade with the United States. Now, other countries in Western Europe had been trying for years and years, but when Matthew Perry showed up with these gunboats, which were the latest technology, he fired some blanks just to show the power of the cannons. And when he met with the shogun, and he was surprised he didn't meet with the emperor because people outside didn't know that the emperor wasn't running things, Matthew Perry met with the shogun and said, "I'll be back in a year, and you have 1 year to decide." The very clear indication was, if you don't voluntarily open your ports, we will open the ports for you using our weapons. Now remember, Japan had been in isolation for over 200 years, which means they were 200 years behind the powers of the Western world, Western Europe and the United States, in terms of their military, their weaponry, everything else. Well, Matthew Perry came back actually 6 months later, and this time he brought 7 gunboats. This is where the term gunboat diplomacy was sort of invented. When the shogun finally decided he had to open to trade with the Americans, and then other countries came along right after that, the shogun went to his other sort of generals. They were called daimyos, and we'll talk about this. The daimyos were the clan lords. They were the ones who, each of them had their own samurai army. They were controlled various areas. The shogun went to the daimyos, assuming they would support him in opening the border, and he discovered that none of them supported him. And that in fact, they were so upset that he had shown weakness in allowing the foreign devils to begin to come into Japan and the influence they would bring, that they rebelled against him. 2 of the major daimyos in the south of Japan rebelled against the shogun. There was a war in between 1866 and 1868 that deposed the shogun and reestablished the emperor as the power, after hundreds of years, as having the power in Japan again. That emperor that got put back in place was this man, the Meiji Emperor. So between 1866 and 1868, they fought a war. It's called the Meiji Restoration. They restored the power to the emperor. The shogun was thrown out. And so from this point on, Japan began to modernize. The Meiji Emperor had a lot of vision. One thing is he recognized, having seen the gunboats of the Americans, we are way behind. And so he decided, we are going to modernize our country. We are going to become a manufacturing center. We are going to equal the power of the Western nations, the United States, Britain, France, and others in Western Europe. So over the next 30 to 40 years, they did exactly that. They modernized their military. They modernized the manufacturing. It was astonishing the improvement that they made under the Meiji Emperor. The Meiji Emperor family ruled until 1912. Well, the problem, though, that they had in trying to modernize and begin to manufacture and to have a modern military was that they lacked any resources to do that. Japan does not have oil, it does not have iron, it does not have coal. And so Japan ended up looking around as to where can we get these things? How can we get all of the things that we need in order to become a Western-style power over that period of time? One of the things they did that represents that, for instance, is, again, the Western dress. They took on Western hairstyles, Western dress, and the Meiji Emperor completely changed the social structure of the country. Not only had they gotten rid of the shogun, he got rid of the daimyos. There no longer were these clan lords that ruled parts of the country. He got rid of the samurai. He downgraded them, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the samurai, so that they no longer had special privileges as a military class, because he wanted to have a conscription army, a modern army, a draft army that people would be trained, rather than have these sort of freelance minor nobility, at which the samurai were, who had simply inherited and grown up in this military order. So Japan is looking around saying, where do we find the resources that we need? One of the things that they had already noticed is that the Western powers, United States being one, but especially Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal, when they wanted resources somewhere from a weaker country, they simply took it. And Japan said, not unreasonably actually, well, if they can do that, why can't we? If we need oil and coal and iron, why can't we go and just take it? And so they started looking around. This, of course, is Japan here. The Qing Empire was still the dynasty ruling China. It was the last imperial dynasty before the Republic of China was declared. The Qing Empire had always been thought of as being the power in Eastern Asia. The Chinese Empire, its second largest population in the world, they had a huge military, but while they had been trying to upgrade their military to become a manufacturing country rather than a rural country, they had not been nearly as successful. The Qing Empire, in fact, twice in the 19th century, the 1800s, had been defeated by Great Britain in the First and Second Opium Wars, which, if you're not familiar with the Opium Wars, Great Britain went to war against China to force them to import opium when China didn't want to. They succeeded in that, plus they ended up, that's how Hong Kong was given to Great Britain to rule for more than 100 years. Fairly recently, it's been given back to China, although it's still administered as a separate region. And so Japan is looking around, and they say, well, the closest place that has oil and coal and iron to us is actually Korea, which is a very short distance across the Tsushima Straits between Japan and Korea. Korea was a tribute state to China, meaning while they were still an independent country, they hadn't been absorbed, they were paying tribute, and they really were under the authority of China. So over a period of time, Japan started to get involved in activities in Korea. They sent legations, meaning government representatives, and there began to be a conflict, sort of an undercurrent of conflict between Japan and China over Korea. Some of the people in Korea were tired of the Chinese telling them what to do, so they wanted to side with the Japanese. Some of the people didn't trust the Japanese, and they wanted to stay with the Chinese. And so there was this constant back and forth kind of thing over who was going to be in charge. In fact, it led to a number of conflicts. These two images are from a time in the late 1800s when Japan actually suffered some military problems. They were attacked by various civilian groups that were in favor of China, and these are images of the legation from Japan, the official representatives. They had a military advisor killed, and they ended up having to flee from Korea aboard a fishing boat. And this created a huge issue. Japan was offended. They demanded that Korea and China apologize to them. In 1875 and 76, as part of the concessions to this, they got an agreement that Korea would open their borders to trade with Japan. So they were able to at least trade for some of the things they needed. But they weren't completely happy with that. And so into the 1880s and 1890s, the conflict between China and Japan in Korea and over Korea got worse and worse. Finally, they were at the point of war, and when they decided neither one of them really wanted that or were ready for that at the time, they agreed, they signed a treaty called the Lee-Ito Convention that said China would remove its troops from Korea, Japan would remove its troops from Korea, and neither side would send troops back to Korea without getting permission from the others. in the hopes that they wouldn't end up in a war. Well, in 1894, there was a major rebellion called the Tonga Rebellion in Korea. It was based upon a pantheistic religion, and it really scared the rulers in Korea. And so when this religious rebellion happened, they asked the Chinese, because they had a long history of relationship with China even before Japan was involved, and they asked the Chinese to help. The Chinese sent in troops, but they didn't bother to tell the Japanese they were going to do that. So the Japanese considered that a violation of their treaty, and the Japanese sent in troops. On August 1st of 1894, Japan and China declared war against each other over Korea. And we have what is known as the First Sino-Japanese War, the first war between China and Japan. You'll notice it's the first one. It wasn't the last one. Now, no one expected that Japan stood a chance against China. Even though China had been defeated twice by the British in the previous century, it was second biggest population in the world after India. It had a huge armed forces, but as I say, Japan had been very successful since the Meiji Restoration in the late 1860s in modernizing, and their military was modernized. China had wanted to do the same thing, but they were not successful, even though they had a much larger army. And so, Japan, once the war was declared, they invaded. By the way, I have this map up here. This is a modern map. It shows North and South Korea, etc. But the reason I want you to notice this little thumb that sticks down here into the Bohai Sea, this is called the Tong Peninsula. And it became very important as we proceed in the relationship with Japan, China, and Russia. So, when they declared war against each other, Japan entered Korea, marched up the whole length of Korea, defeating Chinese military forces all along the way. They reached over into Manchuria. This is Manchuria. It's the part of China that's in the farthest northeast. And then they marched down the Tong Peninsula and took it over, crossed over into the other parts of mainland China. And in 6 months, Little Japan, which is how most countries thought of them, defeated the giant China. And the reason, very simply, again, was that Japan had successfully modernized and the Chinese had not. You see images from those times, and you'll notice the uniforms of the Japanese are very modern looking for that period of time, late 1800s. Their weaponry was very modern. They had purchased battleships from France. They had various other kinds of weaponry they purchased from Western powers. And notice, if you can, this lower left-hand corner, this is how the Chinese military were still dressed in traditional costumes, the same thing they'd been wearing. They were still, many of them were still fighting with swords. So it simply was not a fair battle. And so you ended up with the unexpected result that in just 6 months, Japan defeated China, to everyone's amazement, except perhaps for the Japanese. So Korea was declared completely independent of China at that point, and Japan began to send more and more people into Korea because they were able to have more control of Korea. They got more of the resources, but unfortunately, even though, I'll back up here, the Chinese, when they lost the war against Japan, they gave the island of Taiwan to Japan. They also gave the Pescadores Islands. They gave several other properties, and they gave rights to the Tong Peninsula here. Again, that little thumb that sticks down there. And that was going to be very important because that meant they had a presence in Manchuria in China, which also had the resources Japan wanted. Plus, they thought they were going to have control of Korea. Now, I say they thought they were. Russia had a real concern at this time because, and they're the big power in the north, Russia's Pacific Fleet was based in Vladivostok, which is further up the coast from Korea and Japan. And the problem was that Vladivostok it freezes in the wintertime. And so the Russians could not use their only Pacific base for their navy anytime during the winter. They wanted a port further south that was warm water port, meaning they could use it year round. Well, even though the Chinese had given the Japanese control of the Tong Peninsula when they beat them in the Sino-Japanese War, the Russians went to France and Germany and got them to agree to back them and go to the Japanese and say, you should not have anything to do in Manchuria. Stay out of Manchuria. You know, we're closer to that. We'll take care of all those things. And so you can work in southern Korea. Well, Japan, even though they just defeated the Chinese, did not feel like they could go to war against Russia, France, and Germany. And so they backed off. For a period of time, the Japanese continually tried to get Russia to negotiate with them to say, give us control of Korea and we'll give you control of Manchuria and we'll all be fine. Of course, they didn't really care what the Chinese thought, they'd just been defeated. Well, after convincing the Japanese they should not come into Manchuria, they should not take over that Tong Peninsula, Russia signed a 25-year lease with China that gave them complete control of the Tong Peninsula, and they set up a major naval base in what then was called Port Arthur. Today it's called Lushan. And so the Russians set up a base there. The Japanese keep trying to get the Russians to negotiate so that they could say, we'll take responsibility for Korea, you can have Manchuria, and we'll all be fine. The Russians wouldn't even negotiate with them. At one point, Tsar Nicholas II said he was not concerned with what the little yellow monkeys of Japan wanted. There was clearly a racist attitude that not only Tsar Nicholas but others. So there started to be more and more frustration between Japan and Russia over all of this, and Russia would not even negotiate. You began to see propaganda posters that would show, you know, a Russian Cossack beating a Japanese sailor or punching them in the nose or seeing them as a little dog. Russia thought they had no concern about the Japanese. They didn't have to even talk to them if they didn't want to, because they would do whatever they were told, and if they didn't do whatever they were told, Russia would just step on them. And just like with China and Japan, nobody thought that Japan would have a chance if they decided to go to war. But Japan got frustrated and thought enough is enough, they won't even negotiate with us. So, on the morning of February 8th of 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack. Sound familiar? Japan launched a surprise attack against the Russian base at Port Arthur, which was right here. Again, Japan, Korea, Russian Empire, Manchuria. This is the Tong Peninsula. They launched a surprise attack using mini subs and torpedo boats. They seriously damaged several of the capital ships, the major ships that the Russians had there. And then they mined outside the harbor. Well, they ended up in very short order having a stalemate because the Russians couldn't leave the harbor because it was mined and the Japanese Navy was waiting for them. But the Japanese couldn't do more to try to invade through Port Arthur because the hills surrounding the harbor of Port Arthur had gun emplacements. And so when the Japanese tried to come into the harbor, they were under the fire of these guns. Well, the Japanese, being very determined, certainly if nothing else, they marched up the whole length of Korea and came in behind Port Arthur. All of these stars here are all the battles that the Japanese won all along the way. The Korean generals had the same attitude that the Tsar did, and that is these Japanese, they're racially inferior, they're a tiny little country, why should we worry? And the Japanese won virtually every battle they fought against the Russian military. They finally came in behind Port Arthur, and after a very difficult combat, they conquered the hillsides behind Port Arthur, took over the gun positions, which now meant there was nothing to prevent the Japanese Navy from coming into the harbor, plus from those gun positions they were able to bombard the Russian ships in their own port. What happened was every capital ship, every major ship of the Russian Pacific Navy was destroyed there in Port Arthur. At one point, 2 of the battleships tried to escape all of this. They ended up, one of them being sunk, one of them being badly damaged, and the primary military leader of the Russians, an admiral, was killed. Well, after all of the fleet was destroyed, the commanding officer of the Port Arthur at that point was Major General Antony Stessel, and he thought, hey, the reason we had this port was because of the fleet. The fleet is now gone, literally gone. So why should we keep fighting and losing so many Russian soldiers? So he surrendered, much to the chagrin of Tsar Nicholas and the other military seniors to Major General Stessel. Later on, in absentia, he was accused of treason, found guilty, sentenced to death. Later on, he got commuted. They didn't actually execute him for it, but that's how frustrated they were that he'd given up the port. Well, the Japanese now control the Tong Peninsula, and they now control Korea. Well, Tsar Nicholas was not going to take that lying down. His Pacific Fleet was one of 3 major fleets that the Russians had. They also had major fleets in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea. So he orders the Baltic Fleet to leave the Scandinavia and to sail all the way around Africa, halfway around the world. Took them 7 months. They couldn't go through the Suez Canal because the Russians had offended the British and the British wouldn't let them. So they had to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa. And Tsar Nicholas is thinking for that whole 7 months, I'm going to show them. I'm going to show those little yellow monkeys, that's how he referred to the Japanese. So the Japanese had excellent intelligence. They knew where the Russian ship was. The Russian ships were the whole time as the Baltic Fleet approached. When they finally got close, and they're coming up here, this is Japan, this is Korea. The strait in between them is called the Tsushima Strait. It's a very narrow waterway. Well, the Russians line up and they start through the Tsushima Strait with their ships. The Japanese, who are waiting for them, line up and they do one of the traditional naval approaches is if you catch a line of ships in line and you can cross their T, as they call it, that means all of your ships can fire on them where only the front ships of the enemy. Well, the Japanese caught them in a classic T, and they destroyed every ship in the Russian Baltic Fleet. Little Japan has now destroyed 2 of Russia's 3 major fleets, and Russia had one of the most powerful fleets in the world at that time. So Tsar Nicholas is pulling out his hair, as you can imagine. You know, he couldn't believe that the surprise attack had happened at Port Arthur in the first place, and now he's just crazed. Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. president, offers to moderate a peace agreement between Russia and Japan. And by the way, this Russo-Japanese War is often referred to as the most important and least known war in history. That is, the most important, least known. People just don't know about this. They don't know that Japan completely defeated Russia in 1904 and 1905. Well, Teddy Roosevelt ended up getting a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. But he pleased the Russians, but he did not please the Japanese, because in his moderating, he insisted that the Japanese had no right to demand reparations. In every other war during that period of time, all the way up through the First World War, whoever won could demand that the loser have to pay all the expenses that were associated with it. Reparations, it's called. Well, Teddy Roosevelt would not allow the Japanese to demand reparations, and they had agreed to the negotiations under Teddy Roosevelt. Well, because of that, what the Russo-Japanese War really planted the seeds that would lead to both the First and Second World War in many ways. For instance, Russia believed that the Germans had been helping Japan, and so they were quick to be against the German side in the First World War, and then that affected some of their feelings later on in the Second World War. Japan was so offended by the way the U.S. handled the peace negotiations that prompted them to be more aggressive toward the U.S. later on. And so you end up with long-term effects, which is why it's called the most important, least known war. So now you have Japan is in control of all of Korea and of all of Manchuria, because they took over when the Russians were forced to leave. It was a real misfortune for Korea, because Japan, they started out by making changes that sound good to us. They got rid of slavery in Korea. They got rid of child marriages. They passed new laws in Korea that would allow widows to remarry. That sounds great. But then later on, as I'll talk about when I talk about the history of Korea and the Korean conflict, they also tried to completely destroy the Korean culture. People were not allowed to speak Korean. It was not taught in school. Koreans were forced to take Japanese names. They were, in every way imaginable, the Japanese ended up trying to obliterate the Korean culture. They were not successful, and we'll talk about that some. But one of the other things they did is when they assumed all of the territory that the Russians had previously controlled in Manchuria, for instance, they took over a major railway. It was called the South Manchurian Railway, and they extended it. So that when they extended this railway, they created a corporation called the South Manchurian Railway Corporation. Within just a few years, this had become the largest corporation in all of Asia. It not only ran the railways in Manchuria, but it also was responsible for ports and mines and all sorts of other things. But during this period of time, the Japanese were bringing in all sorts of executive managers. The common workers in these various efforts were usually Chinese or Koreans, but the managers were all Japanese, and there was some racial, sort of profiling on the Japanese part in this regard. Anybody who was going to be in charge needed to be Japanese. So they have a huge influx of various workers into, that is management workers, into this area. Finally, Japan decides, why do we still allow this to be part of China when we are really the financial force driving it and so many of our people have already moved there? So in 1911, the last of the Qing emperors steps down and they declare a republic in China. And then in September of 1931, after building up these industry and bringing a lot of Japanese into Manchuria, the Japanese create an incident as a pretext to send in their military. It's called the Mukden incident, or the Manchurian incident, where they blew up some explosives near to the Manchurian railway that the Japanese controlled, that they had built actually, that part of it. And there was no danger. In fact, the train came through on those tracks just a few minutes later after the explosion, but it was set off by a lieutenant in the Japanese army as a pretext for the Japanese to say there are rebels who are trying to destroy the Japanese properties in Manchuria. They sent their army in, and in very short order, they declared that Manchuria was no longer part of China, but Manchuria was now part of Japan, and they renamed it Manchukuo. Manchukuo was a puppet regime completely controlled by Japan, and in fact, strangely enough, they then appointed the former last emperor, Hu Yi. He had been Manchurian. He was the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. They appoint him as the emperor of Manchukuo, but he was entirely just a figurehead, a puppet. And so now the Japanese are entirely controlling this part of China, which they call Manchukuo. In 1932, the next year, the League of Nations sent in a group to do a study. They were called the Lytton Group, and they did a report that said that this was all a pretext to Japan in order to invade China and take part of their property, and they should get out. So the League of Nations ordered Japan to leave China. And all the Western powers, the US, Britain, France, everybody agreed, you have to get out of China. And Japan went, you can't tell us what to do. How many countries do we have to defeat in a war before we can prove that we can do whatever we want? So the next year, 1933, they left the League of Nations. Japan left the League of Nations, so they no longer had any kind of even political connection with the West that would prove profitable. And they continued to control this area. But even that wasn't enough. The Japanese still needed more and more resources. They had a dream of creating a East Asia area of prosperity, as they called it, that would include not only part of China, but also the areas south. And so in 1937, they created another incident, the Marco Polo incident, which led to them declaring war in 1937 against China. So this area, this is Manchukuo, the part they controlled. Of course, this is China, this is Korea, which had been by now annexed. So all of this was really considered by the Japanese as part of their country, and they were ruling it. They began, after they declared war, to invade into Inner Mongolia. They conquered Peking, what we know of as Beijing today. All of this yellow area, plus you'll notice they had taken over every major port down through here. Every major port in China was being controlled by the Japanese. In very short order, they also took over Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, and various other areas down here. And this was called the Second Sino-Japanese War. It began in 1937 and ran until the end of the Second World War. It really was the first front of the Second World War. It's called the Burma, India, China theater of operations. So before the rest of the Western powers were involved in a war, China and Japan were already at war. In fact, today in China, they refer to it as the 14-year war because they really think it started in 1931 when the Japanese sent in troops and took over Manchuria and called it Manchukuo. So it's known as the 14-year war in China, and here you have just some patriotic posters of Japanese and Chinese military. So the invasion of China continued, and there were really three phases of Japan's plan. Or it wasn't their plan, that's the way it worked out. From 1937 to 1939, there was rapid expansion. The Japanese took over more and more territory. In 1939 to 1943, in China, there was a period of stalemate. And of course, right in the middle of that, 1941, Japan launches the war against the United States with the attack of Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people don't realize that within 7 hours of attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also attacked Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Wake Island, and the Philippines. So all of those were attacked on the same day, coordinated attacks, so that's how they ended up with as much territory as we saw there. And then 1944 and 45 was when the Western powers started attacking again. Now, as they were taking over more and more of China, there were a number of major atrocities that were committed by the Japanese army. And I mentioned earlier that the Great Britain was responsible for 2 wars to try to force China to import opium to offset the cost of the tea they were getting from China. Every country has had the period of time where they're not proud of, where their actions were less than exemplary. Well, certainly this was a time for the Japanese throughout the Second World War. But one of the largest examples of atrocities committed by the Japanese army was the rape of Nanjing, which happened in December of 37 and January of 38. 300,000 civilians were killed, and often in brutal ways. There were actually competitions between Japanese officers as to who could kill more civilians with a sword. These contests, that's the sort of thing that was going on. These contests were reported on in Japanese newspapers as like it was a sporting event. So 300,000, up to 300,000, the estimates vary. Up to 80,000 women were raped during the rape of Nanjing, and almost all of them were killed afterwards. It was during this period of time that the Japanese military government issued what's called the 3 Alls command. The 3 Alls were kill all, loot all, and burn all. 2.7 million people, it's believed, were killed as a direct result of that one command, the 3 Alls command. 1/3 of the city of Nanjing was destroyed. Now, this was the worst example we had, but there was also massive destruction in Shanghai and other major cities that they took over. And at that point, the Japanese controlled almost all of the major Chinese cities in the east and the north. They simply did not have enough troops to control the countryside. So it looked something like this blue area is the area that the Japanese were controlling. Now, during the same period of time, there was a civil war that had been going on in China between the Chinese Communist Party, the CPC, under Mao Zedong, and between Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang, it's called, or the Nationalist Party. They had been fighting a civil war that had gone back as early as 1930. They were fighting against each other, and this shows the 3 areas of control as of 1941. The pink areas were completely controlled by Mao Zedong and the Communists. The larger area here was controlled by the Nationalists, but the blue area was being controlled by the Japanese. Well, finally, in 1937, the Communists and the Nationalist Party decide, why are we fighting each other? Our biggest enemy is Japan. And so they joined forces for a united front against the Japanese from 1937 to 1945, at the end of the Second World War, at which point they immediately go back to fighting each other again. And that lasted from 45 to 49, at which point the Communist Party of China won. They defeated the Kuomintang and forced Chiang Kai-shek and his followers, 7 million of them, to retreat to the island of Taiwan. And that has continued until today, which is why you have 2 Chinas. The mainland of China is the People's Republic of China. The island of Taiwan is the Republic of China, the communist mainland and the nationalist island of Taiwan. But it really, the big issue for the Japanese, while the Japanese Navy, leading up to and after December 7th, 1941, they were most concerned about the U.S. Navy, because they felt the United States Navy was the only power that could limit their control of the Pacific. And that's why they did a surprise attack on December 7th of 1941. And I'm going to talk about a lot more about that as we get into the talks on the Pacific War, etc. The Japanese army was primarily concerned about Russia coming back into Manchuria. That was a big concern. They didn't have an enormous amount of concern about the difficulties of fighting against the Chinese. It's just so much land is the problem they had there. So all of this conflict really boiled down to Japan's desire to carve up China and other areas in East and Southeast Asia in order to be able to control them, to gain the resources from those places. Well, we know how that ended up, and we'll talk about this in more detail in later lectures. I wish I could just, keep you all in here for 8 hours. I'll do the whole story all at once in one straight line. But on August 6th, the United States had developed a nuclear weapon, and they dropped it on Hiroshima on August 6th. And we'll talk about the results of all of that under our talk about the birth of the atomic age. On August 8th, 2 days later, the USSR, the Soviet Union, it's no longer Russia, it's the Soviet Union now, they declare war on Japan and invade from Russia into Manchuria. Stalin had promised the Western Allies that within 1 month of Germany being defeated, he would join the Allied battle against the Japanese. And it was exactly 1 month, almost to the hour, from the surrender of Germany to the Russians invading Manchuria as part of the war against Japan. Then the following day, August 9th, Nagasaki is bombed with a nuclear weapon. 5 days later, on August 14th, there's at the insistence of the Emperor Hirohito of Japan, Japan agrees to surrender, and the Pacific War ends. On September 2nd, a little over 2 weeks later, there is the formal surrender aboard the battleship USNS Missouri, Big Mo, as they called it. During that period of time, 67 cities were firebombed by the Allies, mostly the Americans, destroying even more, like Tokyo in one night, March 9th and 10th, 1945, there were more fatalities and more destruction than there was when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. So because of firebombing, because the cities were made out of wood, and so massive firebombing and burning. There was aggressive efforts in Japan when the emperor insisted that they accept the unconditional terms of surrender. There were a number of different coup attempts. The senior military tried to refuse and then finally gave in to the demands of the emperor. Junior military tried to rebel. Students gathered to try to commit a coup to prevent that from happening. So the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japan invades China, lasted for 8 years by the usual tally, 14 years according to the Chinese, and it resulted in 35 million dead and wounded. The vast majority of those were Chinese civilians, 35 million. In fact, more than half of all the fatalities in the Pacific War were in China. They were not in Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal and all the places we think about. So 1.1 million Japanese and 35 million Chinese died in that war. And of course, as I said, the Chinese Communist Party ended up taking over mainland China. They declared the People's Republic of China in 1949. And in December 8th of 1949, the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, so that you end up with Japan, Korea as an independent nation, the mainland of China, which is Communist China, the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan, with the capital at Taipei, for the Republic of China. There's a lot more detail, which you're not going to hear today, because my talks usually last 45 minutes and then some time for questions, and it's been 43 minutes and 32 seconds. So I did it. Questions on any of that? Questions about any of these? I mean, did you know about the Russo-Japanese War, for instance? The significance of that? And some of these things, which I didn't say, you realize that only 11 years after being defeated by Japan, Tsar Nicholas, same guy, and the Russian Empire collapsed and ended up becoming Communist Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So all of these kinds of events, the battles led to the fall of the last empire, or dynastic empire in China, the Qing dynasty, and the People's Republic happening there. The Russian Empire falling apart, and that becoming the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So the ramifications from this period for all of these places, including Japan and Korea, are just massive. So questions about any of this? Yes?
Do you feel that the treatment of China during that war, during the Nanjing, is still having an effect on the relationships between Japan and China today?
Was the treatment of the Chinese at the hands of the Japanese, does that still affect relations? For the most part, I believe that they have in the same way our relationship with Japan. You know, we can be realistic about the atrocities that occurred, the Japanese against the U.S. military and others, you know, the prisoners of war, and yet realize that was then, and those were those people, this is now. For the most part, I believe that's true between China and Japan, although I believe there's more hard feelings still from China against the Japanese than there is, you know, from between the Japanese and the U.S., for instance. There are still people, especially in rural parts of the country, that still struggle with a lot of that. Yes?
Also the islands, the distribution and
Right.
flow of the islands.
Right.
That's the main mistake.
Yeah, and the destruction of the islands was quite extraordinary. For instance, Okinawa, which was the last major battle, and I'll talk about that. The Battle of Okinawa, half the population of 300,000 Okinawans died in the Battle of Okinawa. And many of them had been forced into the conflict by the Japanese who were controlling the island and things like that. So yeah, there were a lot of things. Korea, you know, tens of thousands of Korean women were forced into sex slavery as comfort women, as they were called, for the Japanese military. Koreans were forced to fight on the front lines, and on and on. I mean, there were enormous atrocities. I do feel that every country has had some period of time in which we have to look back at and say there's no reason for us to be proud of that. In the United States, we have the period of slavery, for instance, you know. And so I think we have to say that was then, and it was horrendous. Relationships between those countries now, you know, between us and Japan. Again, I think particularly in rural areas in China, there may still be more hard feelings. You know, my grandmother still referred to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. So, you know, you never know, because they live in Tennessee. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned France quite a bit. Did France occupy a lot of this area? Why was France so pivotal?
Well, so the question is France. I mentioned them several times, and what was their role in this, and did they occupy? After the two Opium Wars, a lot of the Chinese really were antagonistic toward Western powers. And so in 1900 and 1901, we had the Boxer Rebellion. I don't plan on spending time talking about that. I have a talk about that I did for the first cruise on this trip because we were in China. The Boxer Rebellion was an anti-Western, anti-Christian rebellion. And to address that, because the Qing dynasty in China was unable to suppress this rebellion, it became a huge deal. In fact, they ended up joining it because they were also feeling oppressed by the Western powers. France was one of 8 countries that sent troops to China to quell that rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. And at the end of the Boxer Rebellion, various countries took over certain ports. If you go in China now, if you go to Qingdao, everything's German. The buildings look German. They have the major brewery in China, which is the Qingdao brewery, was created by Germans. So it tastes like a German beer. But that's because they were given that port to control, and others as well, the Germans were. Various other countries, the British had control of Hong Kong, you know, after the Opium Wars. So France also controlled some territory for a time. But the Second World War ended a lot of that in terms of, you know, being taken over by Germany and losing some of their possessions in other parts of the world. The French, all of the Western powers had a concern about this because of the riches of the Far East. Silk Road is another talk that I do. Maybe we'll have, if we have extra sea days, I'll get some of these in too. But the Silk Road, you know, silks and ceramics and spices and all sorts of things were huge. Chinese tea was, especially the British, was a massive demand. And so all the Western powers had a real interest in coming here. France had, like other powers, tried to force Japan to open their gates earlier, as well as China. China went through a period of isolationism as well. They were not successful. The U.S. was successful in getting Japan to open their doors. The British was successful in getting the Chinese to open their doors. And both times, it was by threat of military action. But the French were the ones that sold the Japanese the battleships that they used in the Second World War. And so a lot of the armament that Japan had as they were developing their modernized army, they got them from Britain, France, other Western countries. Back there? Yes?
How did Japan, after 200 years of isolation, accumulate the natural resources to modernize?
So how did Japan, during the period of isolation, develop the financial resources to be able to modernize? Well, they didn't really have enough financial resources to modernize to the extent they wanted, which is why they saw the possibility of using the Western powers approach, and that is just conquer the people who had the stuff you wanted, because that's what the West had done. They did have, while it was isolated and they had been primarily agrarian, they had enough resources to start the process. And much of it is as they moved to Korea and began to have legations and other presence in Korea before all of the Sino-Japanese War, they would begin to trade for some of the things they had. While they didn't have mineral resources and things, they did have other resources. And for instance, they had copper at one point. Most of the copper mines are now depleted in Japan as well. But to be able to exchange copper for iron or for oil. And this issue of not having natural resources may continue to be a major problem for Japan. In fact, during the Second World War, after the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, when the Allies retook the Philippines, Japan no longer had enough oil to send their ships to sea. Most of their capital ships at that point were left in harbor because they didn't have enough oil to send them out. But that doesn't answer your question. They took what they had, they negotiated deals, they sort of controlled areas in Korea and then later Manchuria in order to be able to get them without having to pay for it. So it was just a process of edging your way up. It's like starting any business. You start with what you've got and then you work your way up, I think. Other questions? Yes?
Looks like control of the seas was pretty essential.
Right. Control of the seas is always essential. In fact, Japan learned that the hard way in the 1500s. They tried to invade Korea twice in the 1500s, so back a ways. And they were successful on land, but the Korean Navy defeated them twice, and they had to withdraw. So the naval powers have always been significant because so much, the transportation of oil, for instance. See, when the Japanese no longer had sufficient oil for their ships to go to sea, that meant they didn't have sufficient oil for their ships to go get more oil from areas that they still control down in Indochina. So navies are always important. Thank you all very much for your attention. Today at 4:45, we will have a talk about the religions of Japan. I've already had people asking me questions about Shinto from things they saw in Tokyo and whatnot. And so we'll talk about Shinto as well as some of the other religions, versions of Buddhism that are common. So hope to see you this afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.